The Freyds have managed to redefine one of the oldest issues in mental health, the reliability of memory, so that their problems, their concerns, and their fears now loom in judgment over 100 years of psychoanalytic colloquy. Hi, hello, and welcome. My name is Heather. This is Miss Finn. And this is Nice People, where we talk about the kinds of things nice people don't talk about. This video is part 2 of my series about false memory syndrome and the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. In part 1, we went over what false memory syndrome is and the purpose of the foundation according to their own website. I know it's been a minute since part 1, so just to quickly refresh your memory. In the early 90s, Peter and Pamela Freyd made up false memory syndrome and started the False Memory Syndrome Foundation in response to their daughter claiming to have recovered memories of Peter SAing her in childhood. Great parents. In just a couple of years, they managed to completely flip the cultural conversation about CSA and cast doubt on victims who are courageous enough to speak out. What's really shocking is that Peter and Pamela have zero background or credentials in mental health, psychology, or memory, and yet so many people just accepted that false memory syndrome was a real clinical diagnosis. Their claim was essentially that therapists were convincing vulnerable patients that all of their problems were because they were victims of CSA, and that the only way for them to get better was to remember the memories of abuse and work through it. So because the patients wanted to get better, they made up false memories of CSA. That was their claim. It's important to note that the foundation never presented any scientific data to back up their claims, or to demonstrate that this kind of faulty therapy they were alleging actually occurred, let alone that it was a widespread treatment modality. In part 1, we basically heard Peter and Pamela's truths, or version of events. Well, now we're going to hear their daughter's side of things. And hold on to your butts, because this shit's wild. In the fall of 1990, Jennifer Freyd was 33 years old and living in Eugene, Oregon with her husband JQ and their 2 young boys. By all accounts, Jennifer was a brilliant, successful, and accomplished woman, having received her PhD in psychology from Stanford University before moving on to the University of Oregon, where she ran the dynamics lab and was a tenured professor of psychology. As an expert and National Science Foundation-funded memory and perception researcher, it's fair to say she has a better understanding of memory and psychology than most of us ever will. That year, Jennifer's parents, Peter and Pamela, along with her younger sister Gwen, were planning to stay with Jennifer and her family for Christmas. But that fall, Gwen called Jennifer out of the blue to say that she wasn't going to be coming for Christmas. Jennifer tried to change her mind, but Gwen refused, saying that something was deeply wrong with their family. Now, Jennifer didn't even have to ask what she meant by that. Their father had heavily abused alcohol all throughout their childhood, and they both agreed that their father's behavior was strange and inappropriate. But then Gwen dropped a bombshell and said, "You know our father was SA'd, right?" Jennifer said, quote, "That was like an earthquake for me. It was the first time those words were put to our family in any way," end quote. Upon that revelation, things about her father that she'd always written off as jokes or exaggerations started to look and feel a bit different. She'd always felt uncomfortable around her father and wasn't particularly enthused that he'd be staying in her home, but she wanted to see her mother and sister and have a happy Christmas. But after that phone call with Gwen, what had started as low-grade anxiety at the thought of her father staying in her home quickly grew to the point of being intolerable. Unable to push her anxiety aside, and with the date of his arrival drawing closer, Jennifer started secretly seeing a therapist. She walked into the first session viewing herself as, quote, this together person ready to deal with some stuff that would make me even more together, end quote. But as soon as the office door shut behind her, the together person facade crumbled and she burst into tears. During her second session, her therapist brought up her parents' impending visit, and she got very agitated by it. That response prompted her therapist to ask if she had any history of SA, to which she replied, no, but, and proceeded to divulge things that had always bothered her about her family. Like wishing she was closer to her mother, but how she always felt anxious around her father, so much so that just a few years earlier, when she'd given birth to her youngest, she begged her mother to visit her alone. And there were other things, like the pin art impression of her father's penis prominently displayed in the living room of her childhood home, and how he'd regularly walk around the house in nothing but an open bathrobe and would sit with his legs wide open, exposing himself to his wife and daughters. And how in her teens, he became extremely interested in her sex life, and how she even caught him one time spying on her and her boyfriend making out in her bedroom. The more she talked, even more memories rushed to the forefront of her mind, things she hadn't thought about in years. A few hours after that session, JQ found her crouched in their study, shaking and overwhelmed by flashbacks of male genitalia and rape. She didn't know what to make of the perverse images, and as an expert in memory, she knew that recall couldn't always be trusted. She'd hoped she was losing her mind, that they were just psychotic hallucinations rather than memories escaping from what she called the black hole of her childhood. But that hope was extinguished in the weeks that followed as more memories began to surface. The memories didn't come all at once, or at the repeated suggestion of her therapist, or under hypnosis, as her mother would later go on to claim. It wasn't like that at all. She says they were staggered, and once her parents arrived for Christmas, they, quote, resurfaced with special intensity, end quote. She told JQ that her plan was to just get through it. It was only 10 days, she'd already lived with it for years by this point, and it seemed like the best option for everyone, given the circumstances. She didn't want to ruin anyone's Christmas, and she wasn't planning on saying anything to her parents about what had been going on. But from the moment they arrived, Jennifer was overwhelmed with fear and anxiety. Not for herself, but for the safety of her boys. And her father didn't make things any easier either. Over dinner that night, and in front of her 2 young children, Peter talked at length about how lesbians artificially inseminate themselves with turkey basters. A subject her mother also seemed to think was appropriate. At bedtime, her fears only intensified, and she asked JQ to sleep on a camping mat outside of the boys' rooms. She'd hoped that would be enough to calm her fears, but shortly before dawn, she made a frantic call to her friend and then woke up JQ saying, "We need to get the boys and go now." On their way out the door, Pamela woke up and asked them what was going on, to which Jennifer replied something like, "Oh, one of the boys is sick. We got to take him to the doctor. We'll be back later," and just rushed out the door. Later that morning, Jennifer booked a return flight home for her parents and a cab ride to the airport, and JQ called the house to inform her parents of their sudden change of plans. Understandably, Pamela was blindsided and demanded to know what had happened and why they were being kicked out, but JQ didn't want to tell her why. Peter was listening in on the call as well on another phone in the house, but he wasn't saying much. At Pamela's insistence, JQ eventually blurted out the truth, that Jennifer had remembered Peter SAing her in childhood, and they didn't want him around their boys. I wish I could have heard that moment. Peter's response to the allegation was deeply unsettling to JQ, who claimed that he was neither disoriented nor outraged, but oddly prepared, as though he'd been expecting it for some time, and said, quote, "I have no memory of that. Either I'm psychotic or she's under someone's control," end quote. The Freyds left the house shortly after that phone call, but the matter was far from over. A few years later, journalist Stephen Freyd, no relation, interviewed Peter and Pamela to get their side of the story. Peter claims that he was angry and hurt by the accusations, and that he immediately began trying to come up with a way to logically prove them to be false. Quote, "It had occurred to him within an hour of being accused that the proof would include people outside his family equation. He knew he wasn't the only person in his situation and figured that he could only solve his problem by changing the widespread view that nobody would make such accusations unless they were true," end quote. In addition to claiming that he had no memory of the incidents, Peter made other questionable statements to try to bolster his claims of innocence. Like that there's no way he could have abused Jennifer without someone in the house knowing, because the dog would have barked over the commotion. What the fuck? But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here. I just wanted to include that bit to demonstrate or show what Peter was thinking immediately after being accused. But now let's go back to right when all of this had happened. In the weeks that followed, Jennifer and her mother communicated frequently through letters and emails, but she wasn't ready yet to talk to her father. In these letters and emails, Jennifer made it clear that her intentions were not to go public or pursue any kind of legal action against her father, nor did she expect an admission of guilt from him or an apology. All she wanted was her mother's love and emotional support as she processed things and worked toward a reconciliation. After about 3 weeks of back and forth emails, Jennifer finally decided one day to share some of her memories of abuse, a move her therapist strongly advised her against, and that she would later regret, wishing she'd waited until she was less angry. Reeling from the horrific and clear-cut acts of abuse described in the email, Pamela wondered, quote, if someone else had abused Jennifer and the memory had been transferred onto Peter. She wondered if Peter could have a side of him she didn't know about, but immediately decided that was not possible, end quote. Remember that last bit, that she decided that it wasn't possible for Peter to have a side to him that she didn't know about? Because that's going to come up again later. Pam wrote back, quote, my poor dear Jennifer, no one should have to have such secrets locked away. How horrible. I struggle for understanding since Peter has no memories of all this. I have no memories of all this. In our small house for so many years, how could all this have happened without my awareness? End quote. I'm just going to give Pamela the benefit of the doubt and say that she did her best to be supportive of her daughter while struggling with her own shock and disbelief, desperately trying to refrain from choosing a side. At least not yet. But all that changed about a week later when Jennifer responded saying not to worry about her so much, that she had a great support system of close friends and confidants that she could talk to, and that she felt supported by them. It was meant to be reassuring, a way to ease some of her mother's obvious anguish and worry. But Pamela took it as anything but. As far as she was concerned, the allegations were now public, and she feared that everyone that was important to her in Eugene, where Jennifer lived and where she was trying to buy a house, probably knew. Upon learning that their daughter was talking to people about what happened, the Freyds determined they needed some help. The first person they turned to was Pamela's former psychiatrist, Dr. Harold Leaf, a sexuality specialist who treated abuse victims and perpetrators for over 25 years. In his opinion, keyword opinion, people in the early 90s were getting a little too carried away with identifying themselves as victims of CSA. Oh, hi, Pug. She needs some chest rubs. So anyway, it's not really surprising that Dr. Leaf was quick to believe the Freyds and thought that they were a perfect example of this problem that he thought existed. Now, I don't know if Dr. Leaf really is or was as much of a piece of shit as I think he is. But I think it's important to note that the early 90s were a real pivotal point in the cultural awareness and conversation about CSA. This was all like right when the Catholic Church abuse scandal was getting widespread attention, and people like Woody Allen were being accused of SAing their children. This was kind of new for people. As much as I hate to say it, I can maybe understand where Dr. Leaf was coming from, because at that point in time, the standard textbook of psychiatry and what medical and mental health professionals were all taught was that CSA, and in particular incest, was exceedingly rare, like 1 in a million. It even went so far as to say that there was little agreement as to whether father-daughter incest led to mental health problems later on in life. And that if anything, it helped them better adjust to the external world.
Disgusting!
Yeah. This is what medical and mental health professionals were taught in school. So, I'll give Dr. Leaf that. But that's as much credit as I'm going to give him. Dr. Leaf even went so far as to call Jennifer to try to convince her to get together with her parents, and laid out several reasons why he didn't believe that Peter had SA'd her, such as Peter's sexual fantasies being primarily homoerotic. Yeah, I don't know. The next person the Freyds went to was an expert in forensic hypnosis by the name of Dr. Martin Orne. After hearing their story, Dr. Orne suspected the Freyds were victims of undertrained therapists implanting false memories of abuse in suggestible patients. At Peter's request, Dr. Orne arranged for Peter to take a lie detector test, which Dr. Orne believed were 85% accurate, whereas psychiatrists were only about 50% accurate. That's interesting, considering that the opinions and testimonies of psychiatrists are regularly used in court cases, whereas lie detector test results aren't admissible because of how unreliable they are. The American Psychological Association determined that, at best, lie detector tests might be called fear detector tests. Peter's lie detector test results indicated no deception, but we know, really, it just detected no fear while giving his answers. They sent the results to Jennifer, hoping that they would sway her somehow, which they didn't. However, Pamela wasn't giving up. She went a step further and invited Jennifer's therapist to come to Philadelphia and see the results for herself and to take a tour of their home, just to see if it matched up with Jennifer's description of it. Who does this? Through Dr. Leaf, Jennifer's therapist declined the offer, saying that Jennifer would likely, and rightfully, see it as a betrayal. 4 weeks after declining their offer, Pamela wrote to Jennifer's therapist again, claiming all kinds of BS, like Jennifer was starting all of her classes by saying, "I want you to know that I'm a victim too." And that Jennifer told her that making public announcements and cutting off contact with anyone who questioned her memories was part of her therapy. Both of which were 100% not true, but certainly gives us a glimpse into the kind of BS Pamela would feed to anyone who listened to her. Throughout all this, Jennifer and Pamela were still in communication, but according to Jennifer, the tone of her mother's emails had shifted, and it led her to suspect that maybe her mother was building some kind of legal defense. So to be on the safe side, Jennifer tried again to reassure her mother that she had no intentions of going public with this or taking any kind of legal action against her father, but it was for naught. Unbeknownst to her, they were, in fact, preparing a legal defense. And then some. By summertime, Gwen, in full support of her sister, cut off all contact with their parents. And due to the growing tension, Jennifer wrote to her mother explaining that she too needed to take a little break from communication for a while, but insisted it was only temporary. She ended the message to her mother saying, quote, "I have no desire to punish you, and I wish you no harm. I love you," end quote. So with Jennifer and Gwen cut off, and Peter away lecturing in Europe, Pamela felt very isolated and alone, and began to read and write more to occupy her time. She found comfort in the group Victims of Child Abuse Laws, an organization of people claiming to be victims of the over-enforcement of child abuse laws. One day, Pamela came across a copy of Issues in Child Abuse Accusations, an obscure quarterly journal published by married psychologists and prominent advocates for people accused of CSA, Ralph Underwager and Hollida Wakefield. Ralph sums up his philosophy regarding the prosecution of CSA cases as follows. It is, quote, "more desirable that 1,000 children in abuse situations are not discovered than for one innocent person to be convicted wrongly," end quote. What do we think about that guy, huh? Ralph and Hollida would eventually serve on the board of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, with Ralph having to resign after an interview he gave for a pro-PDF file publication came to light. Quote, in the interview, the couple stated that they thought PDF file relationships, while never positive, could be a neutral event in a child's life, and said that condemnatory attitudes in the United States made it impossible to conduct research to explore that possibility, end quote. Yeah. Hollida, however, continued to serve on the board. Pamela appeared on their radar after she submitted a piece titled, "How Could This Happen? Coping with a False Accusation of Incest and Rape." Using pseudonyms and a mix of speculation and exaggeration, Pamela outlined the allegations made against Peter and speculated on what could have caused their daughter to have these false memories. She blamed Jennifer's cannabis use as a teenager, her struggles with an ED, marital problems, motherhood, career, stress, nursing her son for too long, jealousy of her mother's professional success. Sure, Pam. Having a feminist therapist, and even the widely renowned book for SA survivors, The Courage to Heal. The degree of betrayal is astounding. Dr. Leaf warned Pamela that publishing the article might irrevocably damage any chances of reconciling with Jennifer, but she did it anyway. And get this, even though it was published anonymously, Pamela sent copies of it to people that both she and Jennifer knew, and even sent copies pre-publication to Jennifer's colleagues at the University of Oregon. Really, Pamela? You want us to believe that this was anything but retaliation? Jealous of her mother's professional success. Pamela, of course, was too cowardly to give Jennifer a heads up about the article. And one day, Jennifer's best friend and colleague in the psychology department mysteriously received a copy of the article in her inbox. Curious to know what it was and why it was in her mailbox, she and Jennifer flipped through it. And that's how Jennifer found out about the article. She realized the article they were reading was about her. At that moment, she realized that she couldn't trust her parents at all. And understandably, all communication between her and her parents ended. But Pamela was still out there telling people that Jennifer wasn't speaking to her because her therapist told her not to. Can you even imagine how that must have felt? To find out that your mother retaliated against you in such a public way and bringing up every little thing that she perceived as a slight against you, all in an attempt to discredit you and shield your abuser. And for what? Well, actually, we know what. Because in a follow-up article that Pamela had already drafted, she said, quote, "We are preparing for the worst, a book or a lawsuit, because that has become part of the therapy in many similar cases reported recently in the news," end quote. This woman. A month after appearing in Issues in Child Abuse Accusations, Pamela's article of speculation, lies, and exaggeration was published in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Reporter Daryl Sifford included Peter and Pamela's version of events, including the false claim that Jennifer recovered her memories of abuse while under hypnosis. Sifford quoted Pamela as saying she believed her daughter latched on to her therapist's suggestion of CSA because of, quote, her unwillingness or inability to assume responsibility for her own life, end quote. After the article came out, the Freyds ran ads with a 1-800 number that said, quote, "Has your child falsely accused you as a consequence of repressed memories? You are not alone. Please help us document the scope of this problem," end quote. A few months later, in January of '92, Sifford did a follow-up piece. He ended the piece, which was nationally syndicated, with the 1-800 number. And that's how these families started coming together. In one last effort or attempt at reconciliation, Pamela and Jennifer agreed to meet with a neutral therapist in Eugene. But after speaking to Pamela on the phone, the therapist backed out. According to Jennifer, quote, "She thought it would not be a good thing for me. She also thought it was a dangerous situation for her. She didn't want to be the therapist in the next Jane Doe article. She told me my mother said that if my sister and I didn't stop what we were doing, which I took to mean refusing to reunite with them, that we would be very embarrassed," end quote. Meanwhile, Sifford published 2 more articles, also nationally syndicated and with the 1-800 number. And according to Pamela, Sifford told her that he wished there was some resource he could point all of these other poor, falsely accused, allegedly, parents to. So the following month, the Freyds created one, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. In her article, The Memory War, Katie Healy says, quote, "On the heels of the national panic over satanic ritual child abuse in the 1980s, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation helped shift cultural sympathies from alleged victims to the accused, portraying survivors as casualties of radical feminist therapists who implanted memories of child abuse in gullible patients. With the help of Ralph Underwager and Hollida Wakefield, married psychologists who had gained prominence as expert witnesses for defendants accused of satanic ritual abuse, the Freyds recruited a highly credentialed advisory board. Among the members were Paul McHugh, known in recent years for insisting that transgender people suffer from a psychological disorder, and Elizabeth Loftus, a psychology professor who testified on behalf of Ted Bundy in his 1976 trial before he escaped and went on another killing spree. End quote. The Freyds were gaining support and shaping a dangerous narrative. Within the first month, they allegedly had been contacted by over 180 families and received a grant to study and document this social phenomenon. In February of 1992, the first False Memory Syndrome Foundation newsletter went out. Local and national TV reporters immediately reached out to them, and in response, the newsletters, quote, offered the media constantly revised surveys of members that attached quotable numbers to the phenomenon, even if the information was coming entirely unverified from the accused parents, end quote. The foundation's efforts were not limited to disseminating the biased stories of accused parents. They routinely picketed and harassed detractors, journalists, and therapists. They filed formal complaints and lawsuits against therapists whose patients had made CSA allegations. They lobbied for more restrictive laws governing therapy and executed well-coordinated efforts to prevent news publications from publishing any kind of stories that might rightfully cast doubt on their credibility. So yeah, that neutral therapist that was going to have Pamela and Jennifer meet in her office had every reason to back out of doing that. Regarding one Newsweek story assessing the backlash toward recovered memories, the foundation pressured senior editor John Kapoya and inundated him with letters attempting to discredit the journalist and prevent him from running the story. Their efforts were successful, with the editor saying, quote, "We weren't too sanguine about getting into a huge pissing match with these people," end quote. From this, we can assume that the False Memory Syndrome Foundation did this to virtually all news publications that dared to present an opposing viewpoint to theirs, resulting in almost exclusively poorly researched propaganda in their favor. Quote, in an article published by Harvard's Nieman Foundation for Journalism, psychologist Judith Herman argued that only one side of the false memory debate, the accused parents, were organized and eager to speak to the media, while the other side, composed of survivors and their therapists, often didn't want to identify themselves and wanted mostly to be left alone, end quote. In case you thought Pamela's behavior couldn't get any more unhinged, she offered Jennifer a seat on the board of the foundation, which somehow, to Pamela's surprise, she declined. When she received a list of the professionals who'd agreed to join the board, Jennifer felt shocked, dismayed, and resentful. Quote, many of them were her professional colleagues, or people she had hoped to make her colleagues, and several were longtime family friends from Penn's faculty. Her mother had chosen as a mentor the professor who had first gotten Jennifer interested in psychology. That professor was now on the False Memory Syndrome Foundation board, end quote. I just can't with these people. Remember, Jennifer wasn't public with her ordeal, nor did she want to be. But her parents did everything they could to insert themselves into her professional circle and get her colleagues on their side. And the fact that even one of these people were swayed to begin with astounds me. Things only got worse that July when the New York Times ran a story called Childhood Trauma, Memory or Invention. The story, quote, did not make clear the role of accused parents in starting the foundation, quoted several of its advisors without revealing their affiliation, and misidentified Pamela Freyd as a psychologist, end quote. Jennifer was humiliated by the article, and to make matters even worse, Pamela was now becoming known in her field and competing with her for the loyalties of the leading experts in her field. But not all of the experts bought into this false memory nonsense. In fact, far from it. Harvard psychologist and trauma expert Dr. Jim Hopper said, quote, "I was just astounded that this big lie could be perpetuated with impunity and with great success all across major media," end quote. In a newsletter from the National Center for Prosecution of Child Abuse, one survivor really hit the nail on the head in saying that the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, quote, "is a particular threat to all survivors because once it gains national recognition, it will have the full support, vocal and financial, of anybody who is accused or suspected of SA. The media may also far prefer to deal with a titillating debate over whether SA occurs than to focus on the real and prevalent tragedy that incest is," end quote. Even though the Freyds and the foundation were gaining public support, Jennifer, who still wasn't public, had the support of the people who mattered the most to her. There was her sister Gwen, who wished to remain private and refused to disclose if she had any memories of abuse, but always corroborated the memories that her and Jennifer shared. I found it very interesting that prior to Jennifer's allegations, Gwen had been the target of Peter's harassment and claims of brainwashing after she started attending adult children of alcoholics meetings. Jennifer's grandmother also always supported her as well. And then there was her Uncle William, Peter's brother. In a letter to PBS Frontline, William stated that he had no doubt that what Jennifer alleged was true, and he dropped a bombshell, that Peter and Pamela grew up in the same household as siblings. And that, in his view, quote, "The False Memory Syndrome Foundation is designed to deny a reality that Peter and Pam have spent most of their lives trying to escape," end quote. Oh yeah, Peter and Pamela are step-siblings. That's just the tip of the iceberg. But let's pause for a moment and delve into Peter and Pamela a little bit, because there are some relevant details that need to be considered when forming an opinion or conclusion about the Freyds and the foundation.
It's a wild ride. Get your tea ready.
Peter and Pamela's parents married when Pamela was 12 and Peter was 14. They began dating in high school, and before they became intimate, Peter told Pamela that he'd been essayed in childhood by a local prominent artist, something he apparently pridefully boasted about to his own daughters growing up.
Allegedly!
Although in later interviews he acknowledged that it was, in fact, abuse, he always maintained that it wasn't a big deal and he just didn't allow it to get to him. He didn't see CSA as a big deal. And it wasn't like he was minimizing it to end the conversation. No, it was part of this attitude of superiority that Peter had. Like he's better or stronger than other people. And this attitude comes up more than once and is corroborated by Jennifer and his colleagues and his former students. For instance, in the same interview, Peter claims to have experienced homosexual desires around age 11, but that at age 14, he decided to be heterosexual and said that it's just a decision you make and it's not hard, and he doesn't get what the big deal is. Hey. So it's been a few days. We're back in the Nook. My memory card ran out of room, so I'm finishing the video now. Let's just get on with it. Peter and Pamela married in 1957 and had Jennifer 9 months later. Although they were both parents with PhDs, Pamela experienced a lot of discrimination because she was a mother and didn't get to pursue a career in the same way that Peter had. It's no secret that Peter had a severe drinking problem. In one interview, a former student of his, who went by Stephen, said that the two became very close, and he spent a lot of time drinking with Peter at the Freyds' home. Stephen claims that once Pamela would retreat for the evening, Peter would quickly steer the conversation toward sexuality and would openly admit that he was gay and would try to convince Stephen that he was too. One night, Peter propositioned Stephen for sex, which he declined, and in response, Peter, allegedly, started going through kitchen drawers and pulling out knives before eventually backing off. As much as I may not like the guy, even I can admit that's a pretty wild claim. Kind of hard to believe, right? Except that when asked about it in an interview, Peter admits to propositioning Stephen, but claims that he only did it because Stephen had been begging him for it for so long. And added that it was no secret that Stephen was one of the people he'd inquired about having a relationship with, and added, and this is important, that he assumed that Pamela knew about it. Remember how Pamela said she wondered if Peter had a side to him she didn't know about, but then immediately decided that was impossible? Well, get this. Later in that same interview where Peter admitted to propositioning other men, Pamela told the reporter that she did not know that Peter had propositioned Stephen or any other men, saying, quote, "I didn't see it. It could easily be I didn't want to," end quote. Literally the words Jennifer has been wanting to hear for over 30 years. Incredible. Peter acknowledged in the same interview that he has a, quote, "different idea about boundaries than other people, and an insensitivity to privacy," end quote. And instead of considering the possibility that his excessive drinking might have caused amnesia or blackouts, he insisted that was never the case. And like Pamela, blames Jennifer's cannabis use in her teens for her, in his opinion, warped memory. Jennifer said, quote, "At times, I'm flabbergasted that my memory is considered false and my alcoholic father's memory is considered rational and sane. My father was an active alcoholic during most, if not all, of my childhood, and that alcoholism was denied until I was no longer in my parents' house," end quote. Yeah, Jennifer, I am just as flabbergasted as you are, although not surprised. 30 years later, people still want to believe that victims of CSA are either lying or have false memories of abuse. So that's just a little bit about Peter and Pamela. I thought about going more in depth into some of the other dubious people involved with the foundation, like Elizabeth Loftus, but I think I'll just do a separate video about her and the mall study and all of that nonsense, because that's another one of those things that's routinely cited when it comes to false memories that's total BS. But for now, let's go back to where we left off in July of '92, where the New York Times article came out that incorrectly identified Pamela as a psychologist, and all of the experts cited were members of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. The family did not get together for Christmas that year. Shocker, I know. But Pamela did send gifts, including a pair of G-string panties for Jennifer. What the fuck? Read the room, Pamela. In March of '93, Pamela and another psychiatrist on the False Memory Syndrome Foundation board were disinvited to a conference they'd been asked to sit on a panel for. The director of the workshop, psychologist Stephen Landman, said that initially he was impressed by the False Memory Syndrome Foundation board. But after inviting them and examining some of their literature, he found that although they admit that some reports of CSA are valid, They imply that it's far more common for claims to come from false memories, and even go so far as to suggest that CSA is rare, which we all know, sadly, it isn't. He said, quote, "I do not find the False Memory Syndrome Foundation to be objective, and the use of scientists on the advisory board presents a facade of scientific respectability to disguise a bias," end quote. I 100% agree. As a nice little FU to the Freyds, in my opinion, Stephen invited Jennifer to come and speak in their place, and she accepted. Getting word that Jennifer would be speaking to hundreds of therapists at the conference, the Freyds tried desperately to get into the conference themselves. However, Landman barred them from entering, asserting that the conference was for mental health professionals only, something that the Freyds definitely were not. Jennifer shared her betrayal trauma theory before moving on to her own story, a version that didn't name her father as the perpetrator. Quote, "She refrained from elaborating on what she called her recovered memories of events that she acknowledged she could not prove. But she described a long history of what she characterized as invasive and sexualized interactions with her father that she had never forgotten. She said that since she had told her parents of her recovered memories of abuse, they had invaded her privacy, contacted her elderly mother-in-law, and embarrassed her to academic colleagues and family friends," end quote. Jennifer received a standing ovation. In response to Jennifer's speech, Pamela wrote her own piece called "Trial by Therapy." She disputed many of Jennifer's claims, but went on to say that her Jane Doe article was, quote, "no more a description of historical reality than are memories that develop between client and therapist. It is narrative truth and was written for therapy," end quote. And here Stephen Freyd adds that, quote, "in the false memory critique, narrative truth is never to leave the therapist's office or be acted upon publicly without solid corroboration," end quote. Boy, imagine if Pamela had actually lived up to the standards that she espoused. To have kept her narrative truth private and not acted upon it publicly since it had no solid corroboration. We can just add hypocrite to her list of attributes. I'm happy to say that in the wake of all of this, Jennifer has been living her best life and transformed her own pain and trauma into an organization and research that benefits all victims of sexual violence, betrayal trauma, and institutional betrayal. She is the founder and president of the Center for Institutional Courage. She's a widely published and renowned scholar known for her theories of betrayal trauma, institutional betrayal, institutional courage, and DARVO, which stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender, a common strategy used by perpetrators.
It's DARVO, Randy. Deny, Attack, Reverse Victim and Offender.
She is now Professor Emerit of Psychology at the University of Oregon, and the Dynamics Lab is now the Freyd Dynamics Lab. She's an adjunct professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences in the School of Medicine at Stanford University. She's an award-winning author and recipient of numerous awards, including the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, and the 2021 Christine Blasey Ford Woman of Courage Award by the Association for Women in Psychology. And that's just to name a few. What a woman, huh? I am just as happy to report that the foundation was dissolved on December 31st of 2019.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.
According to them, it was because the internet has made it possible for the allegedly
Allegedly!
falsely accused to connect with each other and share information. The Freyds are now in their 80s, and it appears that Peter is still a math professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And Pamela serves on the board for a retirement community in Philadelphia. I thought it was real funny that her bio states that she was the executive director of a small foundation. Why don't you wear it loud and proud, Pamela? I don't know what you guys think, but I don't think they would have gotten away with all this if they'd tried to start this stuff today. The research and evidence in support of repressed or delayed traumatic memories continues to grow, whereas the research the foundation cites is outdated and has nothing to do with traumatic memories of CSA. But also, the internet has made it a lot easier to fact check their claims and look into the people involved with the foundation. But unfortunately, the damage they've done will endure as long as we continue to look for any reason to deny the reality of CSA and do nothing when confronted with it, especially when it's at the hands of people we think would never, could never do something like that. We have a very misinformed idea of who perpetrators of CSA are and what they look like. That they're strangers driving around in windowless vans and scooping up unprotected children. But the terrifying reality is that 93% of CSA victims know their abuser. They're our family members, neighbors, fellow churchgoers, church leaders, teachers, coaches, trusted family friends. They're people we know and like and respect and even love. And they are everywhere. We all want this to stop. We all want kids to be safe. And it is going to take all of us to have the courage to do it. It is very tempting to take the side of the perpetrator. All the perpetrator asks is that the bystander do nothing. He appeals to the universal desire to see, hear, and speak no evil. The victim, on the contrary, asks the bystander to share the burden of pain. The victim demands action, engagement, and remembering. Well, that concludes this series on false memory syndrome and the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments. And in case you didn't comment on part 1, I'd still like to know if you'd heard of false memory syndrome or the False Memory Syndrome Foundation before, and for extra credit, how you heard about it. I'm also curious to know if your opinion of false memory syndrome and the foundation has changed after either part 1 or in light of hearing Jennifer's story. Put it all down in the comments. And if you liked this video, please consider liking it. It helps out the channel a lot. If you'd like to join us in being one of the nice people who talk about things like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel before you go. And be sure to hit that bell icon and turn on all notifications so that you'll be notified when I do post a new video. Can you say goodbye to the nice people? Send them off with uplifting words of encouragement? Beautiful. Okay, bye.
How it's supposed to feel.